So you okay just to start as it is just right now? Yep.
Absolutely.
Okay, so I let you to introduce yourself to the Hungarian viewers. In a few words, I know I've watched every single video you ever made, so I know you don't like to talk about yourself, but within a few words, if you can just tell a few sentences about yourself, about your background, what's your story?
My story is very long and twisted and probably not super interesting or relevant. But the short answer is the path I wound up taking through life basically immersed me in bodybuilding, powerlifting, strength training, and high-level athletics. I started weight training at age 10 in an organized fashion in commercial gyms. I actually began exercising and training, if you will, prior to that even. Because of my enthusiasm, I was I was able to basically worm my way into a very elite crowd of individuals, partly because I had some native skill and I had a bit of, youthful prodigy, but quite honestly, mostly just, I think, because of my relentless enthusiasm and dogmatic approach, I was able to rub shoulders with people like Tom Potts, Fred Hatfield, Tom Dieters, a lot of names that probably lost to time, but people of essentially the 80s that were very, very influential in the development of high-level athletics. Again, because of my athletic acumen and then also my relentless pursuit of knowledge to make myself better. And that really is the key. It was mostly driven to make myself better as an athlete. Little did I know, little did I realize that my real gift, if I have such a thing as a gift, my real gift was actually relaying that information, not really utilizing it as my own, personal modality for athletic excellence. Which I think I accomplished maybe to a small degree. But because of that and because of the high level of people that I was surrounded with, the pursuit of knowledge, both outside of the classroom and inside of the classroom, was very, very heavily reinforced. And because of that, I pursued a degree in biology, a minor in chemistry. That led me to university, obviously. And at university is basically where things opened up for me, not so much because of the intellectual prowess, not because of the academic prowess. As a matter of fact, I found that rather disappointing. But what it did open to me was access to both tools and individuals. It opened the door to national and world caliber track athletes, national and world caliber team sports. It opened the door to an entire laboratory, a human performance laboratory. And so that was really where I got to kind of find my way in terms of, I really should be coaching. I really should be. And I've often thought of myself very, very much after the fact as a conduit, in that because I was an athlete and because I was a serviceable academic, I actually filled the role of being able to talk to athletes in a language that they would understand, and then simultaneously be able to turn my head and talk to and communicate with academics in a language that they could understand, and hence transmit the information left to right, which gave me a very, very unique value in a lot of those situations. And simply that start is how I got to where I am. I started working with high-level track and field athletes at the university, and that just kept growing into, and then it became boxers, and then it was actually before the days of mixed martial arts, but then mixed martial artists, and then bodybuilders and powerlifters, and I myself was a powerlifter, so that kept that doorway open, and then the advent of strongman, and I just kind of weaved my way through the world of sports performance. And just to be clear, and just to not sweep anything under the rug, most of that was largely the fact that I was knowledgeable in and willing to speak on the topic of drugs. That was probably what differentiated me from most. And again, I also want to be very clear. It's not that I singularly possess that knowledge, because that's not the case at all. But I was either dumb enough or brave enough, or perhaps both, to speak about it, which made me very unique, particularly in the late 80s, early 90s, when no one would do that.
And as we know, that coaching involves a lot of different stuff, from the diet to the drugs to the workout plans and all the stuff. What would you say, which one of these is your expertise? What's your favorite part of being a coach?
That's actually a really difficult question, because in a lot of ways, one, depends on the individual, two, depends on the individual sport. There are some sports that I just find silly and I don't enjoy working with. I'm not going to lie and say otherwise. And then lastly, it to a degree just kind of just depends. There are people out there that are so gifted, they really only need a few little kernels of truth and knowledge to excel. There are other people out there that are so genetically or potentially lacking that basically science and drugs and behaviors are the only thing to prop up their performance. So it's really it really comes down to who and what. I would say, and I don't mean to be silly, but as far as holding my attention, what's interesting to me is more the individual than the actual, oh, it's drugs, or oh, it's nutrition, or whatever. It's the actual individual. And that's one of the reasons why I'm not probably more famous than I am, because I turn away an awful lot of potential clients. I turn away probably, I'm sure I'm not exaggerating to say, a full 50%, maybe more. I just simply choose not to work with them because they personally just don't fucking interest me. And I'm not going to do that.
So as you probably know, that you were known as a drug guy. You are the typical drug experts. That's how people probably know you. But before we get into that stuff, unfortunately, we need to talk about the diets first, the basic stuff, because as I told you before the recording, that my goal is with this video is basically to spread some basic knowledge in Hungary, because I feel like Hungary is a good, I don't know, 20, 30 years behind the real science. And as I told you, very, very basic stuff like carbs make you fat, fructose make you fat, you need 500 grams of protein, stuff like that. This is the common knowledge in Hungary. And I want to basically destroy all this with this video because obviously when I say the same things, it's just not the same. It has to come from you. So I know it's probably a little offensive for you to ask this, but if you can talk a little bit about carbohydrates in general, what's the truth behind that? What's the purpose of that? Do we need money carbs? Do we need carbs at all? Is it essential for life? What's to use the carbs in bodybuilding? So carbs in general.
Well, it's funny because that's a really difficult question to actually frame. You said, for instance, are carbs necessary or are they necessary for life? And the answer is actually strangely no. However, the reason for that no is that they're actually so essential that the body has multiple ways of faking it, in that it's kind of probably a bad example, probably a very politically incorrect and bad example. But the example I often use is during World War II, when America joined World War II, the very first thing we did strategically was bomb the oil fields of Ploiești, Romania. And the thinking was, if we starved Germany of oil, they would not be able to continue fighting because they would have no fuel. Suspiciously similar to the concept of carbohydrates. If we starve them of carbohydrates, they would have no energy to perform. However, being the industrious Prussian maniacs that they were, they simply engaged in making synthetic fuels. out of shale and coal and all the other resources that they actually had. That's exactly what the human body does. If you starve it of carbohydrates, it just simply goes through a bunch of chemical hoops and jumps through these series of hoops to just make artificial carbohydrates that everyone knows as ketones. A ketogenic diet is simply the long way around for your body to make the very carbohydrates that you're not eating. Now, a little off topic, but the quote benefit of that, if there is such a thing, is that because it's a complicated, convoluted process, it's not as efficient. So if you eat 1,000 calories of protein, your body is only able to get about 700 calories of usable carbohydrate-like energy. So there's a 30% loss in the process. Therefore, you get to eat more food or have a larger deficit. So there's a certain amount of validity, perhaps, to the concept of a ketogenic diet. But the part that is lost on people is it's not that carbohydrates are inconsequential. It's that they're so consequential that your body will waste 30% of its net energy just to fucking make them. That's the part that people don't understand. So this idea that no amount of carbohydrates are requisite for life, it's true only because your body will go to any lengths to make them. So again, that comes down to basically a word salad of how do you want to define necessary. In my view, that makes them amazingly, almost fundamentally necessary. Many other people would say, no, they're utterly inconsequential because your body can make them ad hoc. Both views are in a sense correct. However, my argument is and always will be basically predicated on this. One, if you own a machine, a complicated machine, like say an automobile or an airplane or any complicated machine, the less you stress it, the longer it will last. The less you drive your car, or the less aggressively you drive your car, the longer it will last. Every granny has an automobile that basically looks like and drives like new because they don't use it much. The other side of the coin, every young kid that buys a junker, they run the dirt out of it and then it dies. So in a simple sense, taking the less complicated metabolic pathway is going to reduce wear and tear. That's fundamental. The second part is things move subtly into my realm of hormones at that point. What I'm about to say isn't perfectly accurate, but in a general sense it is. There are 3 macronutrients: carbohydrates, protein, and fat. That part's accurate. In a general sense, if you were to eat a large bolus of fat, a large bolus of protein, or a large bolus of carbohydrates in isolation, the fat will do essentially nothing hormonally. You'll eat it, it will be distributed as energy, end of story. Protein, that's mostly true. There's actually a little bit of insulin response to leucine and some other amino acids, but in a general sense, protein does nothing hormonally. However, carbohydrates cause a very significant measurable response in hormones, predominantly insulin, but not exclusively. Okay, so now we've got a situation where of the 3 things you can eat, one of them generates a hormonal response, the other 2 do not. That's significant. Big light bulb has gone off. So now let's look at insulin. Is it strange that athletes the world around in multiple sport disciplines are using exogenous insulin for athletic excellence? We've got a food that generates a response in the very thing that people are breaking the law and risking their health to create. Once again, big light bulb has gone off. That's interesting. Now, insulin over the years has been demonized and talked about, and to some degree, partly accurately, partly correctly, but in a very general sense, insulin is, if not anabolic, and I would dare say yes, anabolic, it is certainly anti-catabolic. So again, we could just look up that word, like that's an interesting word. Let's break the dictionary open and look that up. Anabolic, that which makes larger. Well, I'm a bodybuilder and I want to be larger, so let's put that in the win column. Anti-catabolic, that which reduces breakdown. Well, I don't really want to break down, so let's also put that in the win column. So we've got a food that magically supplies us with this positive hormonal response. Now, it is also true that insulin will potentiate the anabolic effects of fat tissue. That is accurate. However, it's also incredibly childlike, incredibly simplified, and also not super relevant in that, first and foremost, fat, if you eat it, does not require any mediation to enter fat cells. Literally, if you eat fat, it circulates in the blood. If it finds a fat cell, it literally just enters the fat cell with no resistance. Okay, no insulin's required, no other hormone is required. Fat, if you put 2 drops of fat on a plate and just jiggle them until they touch, they just join and make one fat globule. That is how simply and easily fat will enter fat. So this idea that insulin's requisite for storing fat, that's just wrong. Okay, they're just wrong in every way. Secondly, we have this concept called insulin sensitivity. And insulin sensitivity is a very giant and complex topic that basically can be boiled down to what tissue is most receptive to the insulin. And we have multiple, and again, as a bodybuilder, as a powerlifter, whatever, we think of one tissue. We think of muscle. That's the only thing we think of. But the reality is we have multiple tissues. We have organs like, say, the liver. We have adipose, fat tissue. We have muscle tissue. We have brain and all sorts of other organ tissues. So what controls insulin sensitivity largely? The answer to that is behavior. Behavior controls insulin sensitivity for the most part, assuming you don't have a metabolic condition or any of the many things. But comically, even if you had a metabolic condition like, say, laziness or obesity or both, that's actually a behavior. So the reality is it's behavior. So if you're going to the gym, lifting weights, creating muscle damage, creating energy deficits within muscle cells start to get more and more receptive to potential energy because they're lacking it, as does the liver. And coincidentally, if you have all of these assorted tissues and muscle and liver are getting more and more receptive, fat is actually getting less receptive because the body ultimately operates on a semblance of balance. So the way you make insulin less fat retentive is you simply exercise, which is kind of almost a de facto obvious in the conversation of a bodybuilder or an athlete. Notice I separated those. I want to offend people, but that's kind of my job, is to offend people. Bodybuilding, by the way, boys and girls, ladies and gentlemen, children of all ages, not a sport. It is not a sport. There's no sporting involved. At best, it's a fucking pageant. I'm not besmirching it. I love bodybuilding. It's truly one of my original joys in life. But let's be honest. It's not an athletic event. It's a pageant at best. So anyway, that portion's over. So again, carbohydrates are, you could argue, not essential for life. But if you took that argument to its more reasonable long-term conclusion, it's that they're actually so essential for life that your body has multiple pathways to making them or faking them, which is essentially the same thing. So then my second point is that carbohydrates do in fact cause an insulin response, and insulin is anabolic and or catabolic. My argument will be, and I think I shudder to say always will be, because I am open to change, but I think this portion of my song and dance is sufficiently grounded in both science and repetitive proof or repetitive verification that I don't think I'll back off of this. So my argument would be consume the correct or requisite amount of fat and protein, which we can talk about in a minute, and then all of one's remaining energy requirements simply come from carbohydrates because they're cheap, they're accessible, they're easily digestible, and they create this magical insulin environment, which seems to be pretty positive toward the whole concept of growth. And we haven't even got into how insulin's synergistic with growth hormone and other variables. Also, if you get into, this is very deep, but even if you get into the actual presence of testosterone and or anabolic steroids, there's something called binding proteins, which mediate the action of anabolic steroids. A higher insulin environment suppresses binding proteins, which then allows more of that anabolic drug to perform its anabolic goodness. So once again, there's almost no downside to carbohydrates. They're cheap, they're easy, they're accessible, and they're anabolic. What more do you want? I'm a little confused at that point. So now the real rub in the logical arrangement here is figuring out what is the correct amount of fat and protein. That's actually the much more intellectual portion of the conversation, other than just prioritizing, and the priority is carbohydrates, then protein, and lastly fats. And yes, I did say lastly fats. I know people love to love fats. Because the word essential has been tied to some of them. There's essential fats, and there are, and it's true, and I would never argue to the other. However, the difference between something being essential and the essential amount being very small is a subtle but very important part of the language.
So yes, there is the amount we need.
Yes, there is an essential amount. However, that amount is really small. Really small. It doesn't make it less essential, and it doesn't mean that if you skipped over it altogether, you wouldn't have horrific health problems. That's accurate. But it also means that the entire essential amount will fit on a fucking tablespoon. Like, in total. Okay, that's important. So starting at the bottom, fats are basically the topic that everyone loves to dislike my general opinions. There are essential fatty acids. That amount is very, very small. How small is, to this day, a subject that is debated in science. The World Health Organization has done studies and suggests that that number could be as low as 0.1 grams per kilogram of body weight. Now, admittedly, the World Health Organization does their studies basically on what I think is almost criminal type mindset, which is how much is the least amount of food that we can give starving people to keep them from dying, which I don't think that's a good mindset, but it does have a certain amount of intellectual and probably real world validity. So fair play. It looks like in sports, that number is probably a little more like 0.3 to 0.5 grams per kilogram of body weight, which again is still shockingly low. If you're a 100-kilo bodybuilder, that literally means 50 grams of fat is more than sufficient on a daily basis to meet your requisites for life and performance, which is a very, very small number. Now, again, just to clear air of confusion, because people love to rummage through the crumbs in the seat cushions to find something to argue about. I wrote a book on sports nutrition. It's called Post-it Note Sports Nutrition. And it's called that because I've rather facetiously wrote it on fucking sticky notes for a number of reasons, mainly because it's just that simple. It really is. And in that book, I suggest a range between 1 and 0.5 grams per kilogram daily of total fat intake. Why all the way up at 1? The reason is, again, as I spoke about the pedantics of the language, there's a difference between an essential amount and a non-problematic amount. The essential amount seems to be, like I said, somewhere in that 0.3 range. I'm not even taking you that low. I'm taking you to 0.5, which allows a margin of surplus. But then in the same breath, from a practical eating point of view, if you're going to follow other recommendations, which I'll come to in a moment, of eating flesh and oily fishes and these sorts of things, it's very easy to modulate that value between 1 gram and 0.5. And it seems that at 1 gram per kilogram, as much as, say, 100 grams of fat daily for that 100-kilo athlete. Not that that's a goal, but that's an upper sensible value. That seems to work. And that is something that I also am, I'll say guilty of, is that I, rather than a lot of experts, and I'm not exactly criticizing them for that, but I am. I really am. Fuck them. I very overtly differentiate between the perfect answer and the abidable answer. There are some answers that this is exactly the correct answer, but the reality is no one can do it. So let's ignore that and let's address what is the sensible range that we can in fact do on a daily basis. That is why I will allow an athlete up to, say, 1 gram per kilogram, is because to get all the other things done they want and not live on a ridiculous narrow band of foods that's very impractical, the practical answer deviates slightly from the perfect answer for that reason.
Even 1 gram is actually not high. That's not a lot. No. That's actually quite hard to keep at that level, to keep it that low.
Well, it's funny you say that. Here's the thing, again, and I'm not trying to like champion my thing, like, oh, but I'm more intimately knowledgeable about my thing than other people's things. That's fair. If you were to apply the concepts in my post-it note nutrition, and I make recommendations for how to distribute protein selections, beef and fish versus dairy versus legumes, and I make recommendations on food selections. If you follow all of those things, beginning from the top down with total energy intake or calories, and then distribution of what is protein, what is fat, and you follow the food selections, interestingly, about 0.75, 0.85 is the number that falls out of that. And that is one of the reasons why I think it's correct. A correct answer should be coherent on every level. It shouldn't require you to do anything weird or convoluted or goofy. It should simply be the very first decision starts you down a path of correctness. That is why I am very comfortable putting my name on such a thing, is because I think if you just follow the first couple steps, it almost demands that all the next steps be very close to accurate.
And before we move into the protein, just one more question about carbs, actually 2 more. The very first one, more and more people start talking about insulin resistant, being insulin resistant. What does that actually mean? What's the correlation between carbs and insulin resistant, being an insulin resistant?
Well, once again, here's the thing. I'll answer your question, but before I answer that question, I want to say this. The reality is, even in a scientific laboratory, measuring something such as insulin resistance is very difficult. It's more of a symptom than a thing that can be directly measured. There's no gauge on your ass that you can look at and go, oh, fuck, you're insulin resistant. Holy shit. Fill up the tank. Like there's no such thing. It's more of a behavioral response. And that response is, it requires more and more insulin to mediate that transmission of carbohydrates from bloodstream to muscle. Meaning that when I said as you exercise and get lean, muscles kind of prioritize themselves above other tissues to receive the carbohydrates. What insulin resistance means is that begins to then correct or normalize. Because again, being a bodybuilder, and this is very important, being a bodybuilder, or even for that matter, any version of hypermuscular athlete, is not normal. That's important to remember at all times. That is not a normal condition. So the moment you begin to put on super physiological amounts of muscle mass, your body is resisting you. You are doing something that it doesn't really want. So insulin resistance simply means that more and more insulin is required to accomplish the goal in which you're trying to achieve. Now, the consequence of that is you have an abundance of insulin, And then there is a lot to say, work on these other tissues that you don't want to be saturated, like adipose, etc. The reality is most bodybuilders are lean enough and muscular enough that well and true insulin resistance is just not a concern for them. Is it true that they might get, as I said, ever-growing values of plasma insulin? The answer is yes. But again, that's not a problem. The only time it becomes a problem is if the manifestation is they're accumulating adipose. If they're getting fatter on the same or lesser calories, that begins to become a concern. But again, not really because of insulin resistance. It's because it's contrary to their goals.
It almost sounds to me like being an insulin resistant simply means that your muscle mass and your activity level does not match to your carbs intake, rather than you eating too many carbs.
Coincidentally, that's exactly what it fucking means. It literally means that exactly. And on a more comedic note, you hear a lot of this yammering about insulin resistance in relation to growth hormone. And I know we're not talking about drugs, but once again, it's kind of almost the stupidity of the people talking is so apparent in that growth hormone raises plasma blood sugar levels. It does that. That's actually part of its fundamental job. It does that. So complaining that you take growth hormone and then you get high blood sugar is kind of like complaining about taking anabolic steroids and getting more muscular. It's about that fucking stupid. It's a fucking pose to do that. But anyway.
So before we move to the proteins, just one more question about carbs in general. Sure. So if carbs are so beneficial to us and so anti-catabolic or so we can say anabolic, why people still believe that the best way to lose fat, and I'm specifically talking about fat loss right now, why people believe that low carb is to go?
Well, again, here's the thing. That really depends on your language, because to a degree, I don't like the word high or low carb. First of all, I almost never use that language unless I'm making fun of someone. However, no, it's true. And I'm completely comfortable saying that out loud. However, in the same breath, a calorie restriction demands that carbohydrates reduce over time. And my argument would be something like this. Again, let's turn the consideration to, say, an automobile. You have an automobile and you regularly drive X number of miles or kilometers per week, and you require X amount of fuel. You have to buy 100 liters of fuel every week to perform the amount of activity that you do. Okay. If you start to, you also have in the background that doesn't make the conversation. You have a certain amount of other things, fuel filters and other parts that an automobile needs on a regular basis. Those would be analogous to the protein and the fats. Something that you need very unregularly might be like, say, tires. Okay, we'll make that consider that's the fat. Every 50,000 kilometers, you need new tires. That's the amount of fat you need in a period of time. And then the other little bibs and bobs, the lights and the just stuff, that's the protein. Okay. Those rarely change because that's how often they need to be replaced. You only change your oil X number of miles or kilometers or whatever. So those numbers, they do change, but not significantly. The major thing that changes is your fuel requirement. So simply to diet, one consumes less fuel. The car will literally not go as far, and you meet your goals of getting smaller. The only way to get the car to go the same distance is to reduce its weight, its mass. That's physics. That's fundamental physics. That's a very childlike and simple example. So in a general sense, I would say even a high-carb guy like myself will definitely reduce carbohydrates as calorie restriction implies, because it's the fucking calories.
Yeah.
I don't know how else to word that. If you fix fat and protein, the only unfixed variable is the carbohydrates. So instead of going from moderate to very low, I'm going from pretty high to pretty moderate, but it's still a restriction. So again, carbohydrate restriction does precipitate fat loss. I'm guilty. Now, why might some people choose a higher protein, lower carbohydrate arrangement? A number of reasons, ranging from they don't understand fundamental science and biology. That's a completely valid approach. The other, and again, when I differentiated between, say, the perfect answer and the workable answer, things like personal preference, accessibility, culture, religion. There's a lot of reasons why people might be pushed toward a certain direction. However, it doesn't change the fundamental biology that additional protein really serves no additional benefit. That doesn't make it bad, but that in the same breath doesn't make it more good. Just because something's good doesn't mean twice that amount is in any way better. So that's fundamentally the size of it. Is your body is so, I shudder to use the word designed because that, implies a religious connotation, but your body is so well adapted or designed to survive, and that is the fucking key word, that you can feed it almost anything and it will survive. However, that's a huge difference from the ideal arrangement. And by the way, I personally even do mention in my nutrition book that as you get, say, less medicated or start dieting harder, I do have a range of protein from, say, 2 grams per kilogram to 3 grams per kilogram as the target range. I do say as calorie restriction engages, you do migrate from the 2 toward the 3. And as a calorie surplus ensues, you migrate from the 3 to the 2. And that has to do with efficiency. And that efficiency is largely, wait for it, insulin. As calories go up, insulin goes up, which makes the anti-catabolic effects, which are largely associated with protein, makes the anti-catabolic effects such that you can consume less protein and get the same level of efficiency. And as you get a lower calorie intake, you get a lower insulin value, and then you get less efficient with protein. So once again, this evil demonized insulin is literally the mover on pretty much every positive aspect that we can talk about.
So in a bro science language, people say carbs are protein sparing. So that's accurate.
100% accurate. 100% accurate.
Right.
But what they don't understand is the why. If they understood the why, they would feel much better about exploiting carbohydrates.
And then last question about carbs before we move to the protein. Well, one of my biggest pet peeves is people talk about fructose as being the reason for being overly, overweight and causing fatty liver and all kind of disease. Is there any truth behind this? So what's the deal with fructose? Is it beneficial for bodybuilders? Is it good for us? Is it healthy? Does it cause fatty liver?
Again, here is a very complicated subject. It really, really is. First of all, definitions are requisite. What is fruit? What is it? It's just a word. It's just a word people throw around without having an understanding of what that is. Fructose is what's referred to as an isomer of glucose. Again, words probably the average person doesn't understand. Glucose is the fundamental constituent of carbohydrate. It is the fundamental sugar. Okay. C6H12O6 is the formula for glucose. Coincidentally, or not, the exact same formula applies to fructose. However, being an isomer, there's a small difference in the order. There's a transposition. It's the same C6H12O6, but there's a small difference in the ordering or arrangement of it. That change makes it fundamentally different. Okay. Going to deviate the conversation away from sports and basic human health for a moment and explain something that most people don't understand. Starting with Fructose is called such because it largely exists in nature in fruit. However, that does not by any stretch mean that all of the carbohydrates in a piece of fruit are fructose. The reality is, again, a very small portion of the carbohydrates in fruit is fructose. But every single person listening to this is probably listening on a fucking iPhone. Ask Siri how much fructose is in, and then pirate your favorite fruit. A banana, an orange, an apple, a fucking pomegranate. You'll find that it's a shockingly small number. Okay, so that's an important thing. Secondly, you need to understand a little bit of fundamental physiology, which I really don't have time or the energy or the temperament to relay. But very simply, the scale of things within a cell is beyond most people's comprehension. The size of a cell. And then once you think of a cell, you must realize that there's individual apparatus within a cell that are shockingly, unbelievably small. So small, in fact, that foodstuffs, carbohydrates, are bigger than them. So when you consume, carbohydrates, you eat pasta or rice, the carbohydrate is, proportionally this big to something, this big, and it gets broken down into smaller and smaller chains of starch until it's finally an individual molecule of glucose. Even that is too large to actually directly enter a mitochondria. It must be cleaved in half by an enzyme. So this sugar is broken in two little pieces, and then those little pieces can enter a cell. And your body has a huge reservoir, an almost unlimited reservoir of that enzyme. So glucose can be broken down ad nauseum. The problem is that little transposition in the order, making the isomer that is fructose, interrupts at the very spot where that enzyme would operate, meaning a different enzyme is requisite to break down fructose to get it into the mitochondria. Because in nature, and this is the really important part, before refrigerators and supermarkets and packaged foods, the only existence of fructose was in nature, in fruit, and fruit, strangely, has seasons. So the body did not need to develop a year-round intensive supply of the enzyme requisite to deal with fructose because it just wasn't there. So your body has a limited amount of the enzyme requisite to do this. It's something called a rate-limiting process. There's a limited amount of it. The enzyme in question is 2,3-fructinase. It's not important to know that. Just know that you have a relatively limited amount of that. So the answer to this long convoluted thing is most people, and by the way, this is very much one of those bell curves in science, your age, race, sex, lifetime behavior in terms of total lifetime exposure, all of these things influence it. But in general, most people can tolerate somewhere between 30 and 40 grams of fructose, not of fruit, but of fructose. So ask Siri how much fruit is in a banana, then multiply that number to get to 40. So that's how many bananas you can eat in a day without a problem. Now, having that, the problem, what is the problem? Okay, if you consume fructose in excess of that value, your body runs out of the enzyme necessary to break it in half and enter it into the mitochondria. Your body is very practical. It cannot allow things to just pile up ad nauseum. You literally would just die. So it must go somewhere. Where it goes is to the liver, as almost everything in your body ultimately does end in the liver. At the liver level, the liver then deals with it via a different process, what's called the glycerol phosphate pathway, where it basically will then convert that fructose into a triglyceride or a fat. So immediately everyone's little antennas just went up. Oh my God, see, fructose makes you fat. One, there's a difference between converting something to fat and getting fat. And then secondly, the answer is yes, but only after you've consumed an excess of that rate-limiting amount, which is 30 or 40 grams, which is a whopping serving even on a daily level. That's a whopping amount of fruit. You would literally have, probably diarrhea from fiber and vitamin C before you would really have a fat problem. Now, if you're consuming it via, sugary, soft drinks and Pepsi Cola, yeah, it's very easy to get that amount. So absolutely, I'm not going to argue that. But again, going back to, and I don't want to make this about me, but if you go back to the Post-it note nutrition and you look at the foods you're supposed to be eating, rices and pastas and green vegetables and tomatoes and those sorts of things, there's no amount of those foods you will ever eat that will cross you over that 30 to 40 gram threshold. Therefore, it's just not a fucking conversation. It's not a conversation to ever have. Interesting side note. Being a biologist, one of the things I was trained and have continued to exploit is a way of thinking in that, what is the purpose of this in nature? Why does this process exist? And interestingly, fructose is an excellent example of every single thing about life, not just humans, but life in general, is predicated on survival. Think about the time course. Fructose exists in fruits, which, by the way, encompasses things like capsicums and tomatoes and things that people don't think of as fruits, but technically they are. They're berries botanically. And then also things like tree fruits like apples and pomegranates and the things pineapples. They operate on a seasonal time course in that the plants bud in the spring, they grow, they fruit in the late summer. Fruit as in fruition, literally all these words tie together and make sense. They come to fruition and fruit in the fall. The seeds fall, hit the ground, and then you wait to start the whole process again in the spring. The intervention is humans or other animals will intervene and eat some of this fruit. And because fruit all geographically in one area, all fruits at the same time, it is actually possible for animals to cross that threshold and get fat, which is exactly what nature wants, because having fat is exactly what allows you to survive the winter when there's no fucking fruit.
Yeah.
So again, nature operates, dare I say, in this very natural situation where the seasons guide the eating guides the body composition, and that allows for survival, whether it's hibernation or just famine, and then the process begins again. So just because it doesn't suit your personal contrivance of bodybuilding doesn't mean it isn't a very sensible, natural thing to happen.
Makes sense. Right.
Yeah.
So let's move to the good stuff. Protein. What's the more important? Protein quality or protein quantity?
Again, I don't know if that's a question that's good to ask. I don't think that's a question to ask, is which is more important, because to a degree, either relying exclusively on either is wrong. You can eat all the protein in the world, but if it's of horrible quality, there will be deficits. And then the other side of the coin is if you eat the perfect protein, literally, if you eat fucking humans, it's the perfect protein. But if you undereat it, there's no real benefit. So it's not really a question that you can differentiate into an A, B, this one's more important than that one. I would say approximating an accurate answer in both regards is the better answer. Starting with protein quantity, I, in my book, reference Lyle McDonald's book titled The Protein Book, which I think every single human should go out and buy. Even before my book, you should buy that book. And it does an excellent job of basically explaining all the fundamentals of protein, what it is, how it works, the arrangement, the organization, all of that, the chemistry. And then lastly, it does a very good job of summarizing all the fundamentally seminal studies in protein metabolism. And if you average those, the answer is actually 1.8 to 3.2 grams per kilogram. I took it upon myself. I took the liberty of rounding that to 2 to 3. 2 to 3 grams per kilogram, depending on assorted conditions, seems to be the correct answer. That is more than enough to not be deficient, but not so much as to be egregious in almost every condition. That literally is the definition of the answer I was looking for. So 2 to 3 grams. Now, once you've dialed that in, then the next question is, how do I get the most possible quality within that quantity? And the answer to that is very offensive to people. The answer to that is variety. Not whey protein, not whey protein isolate, not fucking emu protein or any other dumb individual, expensive, pay me money because I have the secret answer. No, the answer is variety. I will very briefly try to explain why. If you've ever played the game Scrabble, and I'm assuming, I'm trying not to be hyper American centric, I'm assuming that's a game that exists the world around. It's this scenario where you have a bag of letters, and then you try to spell words, whether it's in the English language or some other language. And again, whether it's the English language or some other language, there is sort of a statistical probability. In English, R, S, T, and vowels are by far the most utilized letters. So it makes sense that when you reach in the bag, you want mostly those because they're going to allow you the most arrangement of creating words. However, there are outlying words in the English language, xylophone and assorted other words that rely on very obtuse letters, X's, Y's, Q's, W's, letters that aren't prevalent. However, without them, you simply cannot spell those words. That is very analogous to how protein works, in that the letters are now amino acids, and you arrange the amino acids into words, which are now full proteins. And just like words in a language, there is a statistical probability that leucine, valine, glycine, etc., are going to be most relevant. But there's always going to be that random protein that you cannot create without an outlying amino acid. So no matter how high quality, and by the way, high quality simply means possessing those common letters, no matter how high quality, it will still be deficient in some of those outlying. So the reality is low quality proteins fill the gaps in high quality proteins, meaning that the low quality proteins could actually be the linchpin in getting true protein coverage. And again, not to make things about me, but I went to the trouble of explaining a protein distribution. X percentage of red meat fleshes, X amount of white fishes, X amount of protein from vegetable sources, X amount from dairy. And if you very roughly follow those guidelines, you cover all of the spectrum of amino acids, creating continuity. Anytime you rely overly on any one source, you are by definition creating a deficit somewhere. Even if your choice covers the predominance of other things, it still must leave a deficit somewhere. So variety is in fact the secret.
And there's a question about protein, and I know you will like it because I know how much you like natural bodybuilding. So I have to, ask. There's a common misunderstanding about protein intake and being natural or being enhanced. People, especially in Hungary, I don't know what about the other part of the world, but people firmly believe that when you're natural, you need less protein, and when you're enhanced, you need more protein because you're using PEDs. So is there any truth to this?
No, none whatsoever. It's utterly and completely upside down, backward, and wrong. There's zero logic to that. For every reason. One, if you're enhanced, you're by definition larger. You are bigger. Because you are bigger, you're eating more calories. Because you're eating more calories, you produce more insulin. We've already established that insulin is anti-catabolic. So beyond even the slightest argument of anabolic steroids or the chemistry thereof, just from a dietetics point of view, because you're bigger, You eat more. Because you eat more, you make more insulin. That insulin preserves, protein sparing, your protein. So just from the numbers, that's really stupid. Then you actually look at anabolic steroids, like, for instance, just Wikipedia that shit. You'll find that largely the description of how they work is improving protein efficiency. Say those words to yourself really slowly. Fuck that. Say them out loud even. Everyone together. Improving protein efficiency. If you are more efficient, by fuck definition, you do not need as much because you are more efficient. Works money. If you become more frugal, you don't need as much money. That's how it works.
Cool. Makes sense. Makes sense.
That's the pain of it. When you say it, when you actually absorb the words for what they mean, and you lose your predispositions, it makes so much sense. It's embarrassing.
Right. So as probably we covered, the basic nutrition stuff, and we've got about half an hour left. So let's talk about the good stuff. Let's talk about the expertise, about the drugs. So what is anabolic steroids and what is steroids? What's the difference?
All right. Well, this is actually a really good place to start the conversation, because most people join the conversation with not just a lack of knowledge, but a lack of language. One of, if not the most life-shaping things that was ever said to me was by a professor in college, which is kind of surprising because in general, I didn't have a particularly good experience in university and I didn't take away an awful lot. But this is actually probably the most profound thing I did take away. He said, and I over the years, I might be ever so slightly misquoting him, but in a very, very, very general sense, he said that to have a thought, no matter what it is, you think something as silly as, I want to go in the kitchen and make a sandwich. Those words form in your mind. You have the thought in language. You don't operate like a cartoon where a picture of a sandwich appears and then you walk to it like some sort of silly Warner Brothers cartoon. You think in language. And in the context of, I want to make a sandwich, those are very simple words that we all understand, and there's no problem. However, if you want to have a thought that you've never had before, you need language to define that thought. Therefore, the width and birth of your language, your vocabulary, and your ability to wield it determines the width and birth of your potential thoughts. If you can't articulate the thing, you can't think of it. So defining things in a way that you, me, and everyone else in the conversation can understand is requisite for having the thoughts. Language controls thought. You can see it all over politics when people use certain words to steer the attitude of a conversation. It's language determines thoughts. So my point is this: we need to really clearly define these things so that when we have a conversation about steroid this or anabolic steroid that or androgen this, we know what exactly we're talking about. So let's start with the most fundamental, and that is steroid. Steroid is a hyper-generic term that is defined as, in essence, I'm not holding a dictionary open, so this is from personal vernacular, but a steroid is having been derived from cholesterol and possessing a steran structure, which is a 4-ring scenario that you've seen every picture of testosterone or estrogen. It's these A, B, C, and D rings, this 4-ringed structure. That is a steroid. That would include things like testosterone, estrogen, progesterone, pregnenolone, cholesterol. Okay, those are all steroids. Okay, now within steroids, we have androgens. Androgens is predicated, it's a hybrid between Greek and English, or Greek and English, and that is andro, as in to make male, Androgen is a steroid responsible for creating masculinity. Estrogen is exactly the opposite. It is a steroid responsible for creating femininity. Okay. Anabolic is a word that you can crack open a dictionary or ask Siri. Anabolic is the science word for to make larger, to make bigger. And catabolic is to make smaller. By the way, a little interesting subnote that isn't relevant to this portion, but it's interesting to the language of definitions. Getting fat is technically an anabolic process. Most people don't consider that. They throw these words around so casually that they just assume all anabolism is muscle, when in reality you can anabolize, the left ventricle of your heart or the fat in your ass or any other thing. Anything that can get bigger will in fact anabolize. So remember that. That's also important. So anyway, we've got steroid, we've got androgen, estrogen, and then below that, we can start to sub-nomenclate. Testosterone, okay? Again, you can literally break the word up. Testosterone. Road is a hormone. Test as in testicles. It is the androgen produced in the testicles. Estrogen is literally it doesn't connotate the location, but it's the hormone produced in females. Now, here's where we get to the really subtle and also how most people don't understand science as a whole. Unlike religion, where basically hat size determines your importance. Local, people in a church have little tiny hats, and then you go up to the, regionally they have a much taller hat, and you get all the way up to the Pope. He's got a big ass, cowboy hat, the size of the fucking Eiffel Tower. So apparently hat size determines your relevance within the church. And the point I'm making is the bigger the hat, the closer to the word of God. So in religion, largely things do not change over time. It's just God said this and it's this way. Trust me, I know. In science, things in fact change. Every couple of weeks, somebody has to go, oh, fuck, I was wrong. I'm sorry. And we start again. Science is actually quite dynamic. Okay. When I went to school, there was a very hard differentiation between androgen, that which makes male, and anabolic steroid. Anabolic steroids were defined as synthetic derivatives of testosterone. Okay. That was predicated on obviously the creation. They are in fact synthetic derivatives of testosterone, but it was also partly predicated on the purpose of that synthetic derivation, which was to try and differentiate the masculinizing versus the anabolic processes. It turns out, after almost 100 years of searching, that isn't really as possible as we thought it was. And so the hard distinction between androgen and anabolic steroid is less relevant. They are still technically synthetic derivatives, but the point of that synthetic derivation is a lot less relevant. So people going through university now don't make androgen anabolic steroid because it's not taught as a particularly big distinction. When I went to school, it was because we thought at the time that was kind of the big linchpin between, good and bad or whatever. So my point is, one, you'll hear me say that because to me it was beat into my head as a very important point. And you won't hear that from a younger generation of expert. And it's not because one of us is extra right or extra wrong. It's because science changes over time. Okay. However, there is a distinction in that the purpose of creating anabolic steroids was to take testosterone, which does many things. It does build muscle. It also creates aggression. It also has neurological impacts. It creates action at the actual reproductive level. It drives, libido and all these other things. It's also a substrate for conversion. Testosterone can become DHT, estrogen, an assortment of other subhormones. So it serves a lot of purposes. The purpose of anabolic steroids was to try to steer that effect, exaggerate the anabolic processes, and minimize some of the other processes, which for the large part they do. But that was the purpose of it, was to try and tame, if you will, the beast that is testosterone. This is in males. This is important to make the distinction in males. The order of events would be your liver manufactures cholesterol. Yes, I said your liver. Notice I didn't say bacon or pork fat or anything. Your fucking liver manufactures cholesterol, okay? Enzymes go to work on that and then convert that into a series of subhormones. By the way, cholesterol is in fact actually a hormone. So cholesterol then becomes pregnenolone, DHEA, and then ultimately perhaps testosterone. Okay. Then the story does not end there. Testosterone can do all its cool testosterone-y things. It can build some muscle and do all these other things. But then other enzymes act on it and can cleave it, say at the 5-alpha position, and reduce it, hence the enzyme 5-alpha reductase, and create DHT, which is an entirely new hormone which has its own good and bad effects. And then also in adipose, in fat tissue, an enzyme called aromatase can be created, which will aromatize testosterone, making testosterone estrogen. And then estrogen will do all the cool things that estrogen does. By the way, most of which are good, not bad, but that's probably a separate conversation. So my point is this is a very tiered and systematic process. One of the other reasons for a desire to create anabolic steroids was perhaps to create them in such a way that they're no longer capable of producing large amounts of, say, estrogen or DHT. That is probably the biggest benefit that anabolic steroids brought, is you can get testosterone-like actions with a relatively limited amount of estrogen and or DHT. My dog has come to visit. Come on. I know you won't relent unless I let you up. Come on. No? All right. The hell with you then. Okay.
Right. One question come to my mind about testosterone in particular, that people believe that increasing your dietary fat intake will increase the cholesterol level, and therefore you can produce more testosterone sex hormone. Is there any validity to this? Does it work?
Well, again, let's close our eyes and just think about the world we live in. If that argument was valid, it would mean that every fat ass around the world swallowing Lipitor to stay alive would actually be a bodybuilder. And yet that doesn't seem to be the case.
Yeah.
So I'm just going to call bullshit on that argument just by observation, without knowing any clever chemistry or science or, anything, without looking anything up on my fucking iPhone. I'm just going to say the world I live in does not seem to suggest that that's valid.
And when it comes to PED user bodybuilders, we don't even produce hormones, let's face it.
100%. And again, that argument's almost exactly as you said, it's self-defeating. If you're going to take exogenous hormones, whatever little bit of fat was requisite to make them becomes utterly moot. So you didn't need much to begin with, and now you're not even doing what you thought you were doing, so now you need none. It's a very, very stupid argument. Now, again, just to go back to that, it's not as if fat is irrelevant. Fat is relevant in preserving the health of brain cells, nerve cells, which are brain cells. Brain cells are nerve cells. But and cell membranes, and so there is uses for fats around the body. But just understand that it's very, very nominal.
Right. And if we talk about testosterone as a product, as a synthetic testosterone, people has this idea that testosterone only exists from the, 70s and 80s, and, bodybuilders only, and bodybuilders only started using PEDs and testosterone from the 70s, let's say 80s. but the real case is, if you can, just a few words about, you know, the history of testosterone.
Well, again, I'm a little, I guess the only word I could use is annoyed that people don't do any research, literally any. We live in an era where I don't want to martyr myself. I don't want to martyr myself, but I turn 50 next week. I will be 50 years old next week. In the beginning of my intellectual pursuits, information was so difficult to find. You know, we're in an era, the middle to late 70s. You know, we're in an era when there was 3 channels on television and none of them had anything useful. There was no internet, there was no, you know, iPhones or Android, and when you wanted information, you literally had to go to a building. You had to walk and then take a bus, and then, you know, it was a fucking adventure. And you went to a building where they kept all the books, and then hoped and prayed that they even fucking had the book you want. And you hoped and prayed that it had all the fucking pages you wanted. And half the time you didn't even find the book you were looking for, or the book you were looking for wasn't the right book, and you had to look for a different book. And there were these drawers a mile fucking long with all these little fucking cards with gibberish on them that you had to use to identify the book and then go off and fucking have a treasure hunt to fucking find it. I'm describing a library, by the way, for those of you that have no idea what I'm talking about. So my point is, I had to do that. I literally had to spend an entire day on buses and trains to get to a fucking building that maybe had the information I wanted. Today, you can literally, in words, ask your fucking phone a question and it will tell you. One of the questions that might, just might, bubble up in your silly fucking fuzzy head is, when was testosterone patented? That's a sensible fucking question. Well, you would find, coincidentally, that depending on whose version of history you use, somewhere between 1928 and 1935. Okay, so right out of the gate, right before that's patented, as in stamped, signed, and delivered. Okay, 1930s, very early 1930s, pre-World War II, one might say. Probably not a coincidence, again, that it was a German scientist that actually did the patenting on that particular product. The Nobel Prize was given to a German chemist. I believe it was 1935. I think the actual patent was 32, but I'm not certain. But in 1928 was the first real literature on testosterone. In science, most of the advances come on the back of technology. Somebody will invent a gadget, and then that gadget will be used to make new discoveries. For instance, Galileo goes down as this great thinker, but the reality is somebody, an artisan, created the ground glass lens. Some glassmaker somewhere in Italy created a ground glass lens. It was a neat little novelty of gadgetry. It took someone as intelligent as Galileo to think, oh, hey, I could look at the sky through this thing and see things that other people never saw. So yes, he was innovative and a genius, but the reality is the gadget allowed the advancement. That applies almost universally through science. A gadget is invented and somebody figures out a cool way to use the gadget, finds out something new. Testosterone actually falls in exactly that category. In the 1880s, during the Industrial Revolution, the same gadgetry that created assembly lines and allowed for the manufacture of guns like Remington, rifles, and those sorts of things also wound its way into clock making. That same technology that wound its way into clock making then ultimately wound its way into laboratory wear. And a clock maker figured out a way to make a laboratory centrifuge, which is just basically a little carousel. It's a thing you put vials in and it spins. Kind of silly, except it was the linchpin in all of biological science moving forward. So in the late 1880s, this laboratory centrifuge was invented, and every gentleman scientist around the world needed one. So every rich asshole that could afford one bought one. And they started spinning things. Everybody spun something different. Everybody latched onto their favorite thing. In England, there was a guy spinning blood. plasma. He separated, red blood cells from white blood cells from plasma. It was super groundbreaking work. Other people spun, pond water, and we discovered amoebas, and other people spun fucking semen. Just if it was a liquid, there was somebody spinning it. The same applies to, for reasons I cannot understand, dog urine. A guy in New York City thought it was really exciting to spin dog urine. And lo and behold, if you spin enough dog urine, a yellow waxy crystal precipitates out of it. That yellow waxy crystal, no one knew at the time, is in fact testosterone. So in the late 1880s, testosterone was a tangible thing. And at which point you could then take it and say, inject it back into the dogs to find out what it does. And you would find that it made the dogs aggressive and sexually active, and light bulbs started to go off. There's something there. That's an interesting thing. So literally right around the dawn of the 20th century, testosterone was a thing. By 1928, it was a thing that could be produced in a laboratory. By the very early 1930s, it was a patented product that you could go into a store and buy.
That goes the idea that, the people before the Arnold era, they were all natural, because that's what people firmly believe. The Stevie Reeves, John Grimack, they were all natural. Were they?
Probably not. Almost certainly not. For a number of reasons. They were exceptional, which tends to lead to the conclusion that maybe something exceptional is going on. Secondly, unlike today, there was no internet, there was no pervasive dissemination of knowledge, so largely only prominent and or wealthy people would even know that such a thing existed. So it's very not coincidental that these people lived in places like London or New York City, very proximal to the industrial centers, the knowledge centers, and they also happen to be well financed. It wasn't just garden variety country farmers that happened to be these world-class athletes. They were very prominent people, and their prominence predates their athletic superiority. But anyway, that is a long, complicated story. But testosterone is a very, very old product. Literally, I don't joke when I say it's 100-year-old technology at this point. The actual anabolic steroid, which is then defined by me and many others as a synthetic derivative, that came along a bit later, as in the late 1940s. By 1947 or 8, people were figuring out that you could alkylate testosterone and create a oral version, which happened to be then later patented as Android F, which is methyl testosterone. Not a coincidence. Again, a German individual did that. But then the quintessential Dianabol came along, and on paper, the early 50s, was put on the market in 1958. So again, very early, this idea that it's some artifact of the 70s is just wrong. As a matter of fact, all of the steroid technology was basically done before the 1980s. The most recent and newest, most technologically advanced steroid, which depending on who you ask would either be trenbolone or primobolan, both were well and truly ingrained in the market pre-1980.
There you go. Okay, Broderick, we're getting really close to our time limit, so I'm going to ask you the last question, which will be quite easy. I'm sure you will enjoy that. So people believe that steroids were always illegal, but we all know that's not the case. So where was the point in the history when they became illegal, and who's responsible for that? So now you can talk about your dear friend. We all know.
Well, honestly, first of all, that's almost a very slippery question. When steroids were first created, the 1930s, was what's referred to in chemistry as the golden era of organic chemistry. That's when most of the drugs we know and enjoy, opioids and Lasix and all of the penicillins, all of the very fundamental drugs came out of that era. The initial response to the creation of those drugs was incredibly positive. It was, look how smart we are. Look what we've managed to do. The world will be a better place. We will cure disease. We will ease pain. We will make you bigger and stronger. It was that Captain America mindset. Yet we can, in a laboratory, we can make you a better person. That was the initial response to these things. Not negative, not the pullback. It was human frailty and human jealousy that slowly drove the pushback against these things. As people that had the motivation to take risks, do work, those sorts of things, and excel, began to offend the lesser people. And I know that's a very insulting thing to say, but it's my synopsis of history. Most of the call to outlaw basically anything is basically driven by petty insecurity. I don't want to be a world-class athlete, so you shouldn't be either. Fuck, that's horrible, you know. So just know that the original reception to these things was very, very positive. And then slowly over time, it became more and more anti. Even up to and including, interestingly, the 1970s, Ken Patera, who was an American weightlifter and one of the very best to ever live. He's still alive, but he, you know, in the early 70s, he was quite literally one of the best. He was the third man to press 500 pounds over his head. He was the first American. Vasily Alexia, then Serge Redding, then Ken Patera. That's not relevant. But Ken Patera, this is how non-demonized steroids were at the time. Ken Patera actually famously said on television, in the upcoming 72 Olympics, we will find out whether American or Russian steroids are superior. He didn't even say athletes. He said steroids. He literally was pitting our technology against theirs. Said that live and in person on television in front of everyone. So this idea that, you know, steroids were always illegal or always demonized, just foolish. It's not true. It wasn't really until money became an issue and people could make money by making rules. And one of the major movers in that was the gentleman who is currently our American president right now, Joe Biden. Apparently, in college, he fashioned himself as some sort of an athlete, and he played baseball. And as one might suspect looking at him, he sucked. And he personally blamed his inabilities on the fact that everyone else was using drugs and he couldn't. And so he basically personally took a vendetta against anyone who could fuck a cheerleader, was obviously taking steroids and, you know, illicit. And he spent his entire 40-year, 50-year political career slowly, incrementally demonizing steroids. The Anabolic Steroid Control Act of 1990 was not his work, but he championed it, pushed it, used his personal leverage to ultimately make steroids illegal. And by the way, that was the date. Steroids were not illegal in the United States until 1990. The middle of 1990, as a matter of fact. And then later, I think it was 94 or 5 was the secondary act that made pro hormones equally illegal. That was very specifically, that was Joe Biden. His name was on the bill. But nonetheless, he almost exclusively, you know, basically because of his own petty insecurities and his ability to make money predicated on those insecurities, are why steroids are illegal. And to this day, in very, you know, prominent first world countries around the world, the United Kingdom, for instance, where you are right this moment, Canada, Brazil, steroids are not illegal in the slightest. So it's not this idea that, you know, we're, you know, leading the charge into, you know, righteousness. No, it's just fucking arbitrary bullshit. And it means nothing. You know, but yeah, the illegality of steroids is almost exclusively just an artifact of petty human insecurity.
Right. Broderick, I've got 2 million questions to ask, but we reached our time limit for today. So just a very last question before I let you go. If people want to be coached by you, I know you said you turn off at least 50% of the inquiries, but if people want to reach out for you, they have a question, how can they find you? How can they contact you? Have you got
I will answer that, but I'll answer that first with a piece of advice. And this is not as nearly as self-serving as it sounds. My advice would be, if anything I said makes sense or radically conflicts with what you already think you know and has raised a bunch of questions, I would suggest the first thing you do is spend the paltry $15 that I charge to join my member site, where you can hear me talk literally for 500 hours. Okay. That would be a very sensible use of both of our time and money. I would suggest you start there and just immerse yourself in my general attitudes and the explanations behind those attitudes. And then at that point, if you still have questions that you think aren't addressed within that material, then I'd be happy to answer them. But just arbitrarily answering questions that I've already answered literally 100 times is not going to go well. It's not going to generate a very positive response. So I would suggest, rather than you asking me a question and me telling you to basically go fuck yourself, a much better approach would be invest the $15 in your overall education. The worst case scenario is you say, God, that was horrible, I'll never do that again, and you ignore my name for the rest of time. The best case scenario is you actually learn enough to actually realize what the question you want to ask really is.
Yes. I had to be really, really general with my questions, just for the viewers. But of course, I know that if I ask you privately, I would be way more specific than I was in the show. Right, Broderick, we reached the time limit. Thank you very much for being on the show. It was amazing. Thanks for the viewers to watch this. And then hopefully you come back for the second one and then the third one, and we'll see in the future. Right. Thank you. Thank you.